Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Retro Muscle. In today's video, we'll be wrapping up the first ever IFBB Grand Prix series as we cover the Grand Prix Finals, or more famously known as the Night of the Champions. And anyone who'd like to catch up on the previous shows, please be sure to check this video's description, and there I'll link the other 4 shows, but let's get back to New York City's now traditional competition, the Night of the Champions 3. The competition took place on May 10th at the Beacon Theater in Manhattan, New York. And this show, along with the rest of the Grand Prix circuit, was sponsored by Da Vinci Labs, and this competition was promoted solely by its creators, Wayne DeMilia, Karen Clark, and Charles Blake, or better known as Physique Productions. Since its inception in 1978, the Night of the Champions was a successful promotion, and this day was no different as it drew a crowd of nearly 3,000 fans, which is basically a packed house for the Beacon Theater. According to Chris Lund's article, he described the Beacon Theater's foyer as a bodybuilding marketplace, as a lot of the competitors had their iconic t-shirts and photographs for sale, not to mention supplements and muscle mags. But prejudging for this competition didn't begin until 2:30 in the afternoon. So before we get there, first I'd like to list off the judges for this show since there were some major changes made. Now, for the entire series, Bill Pearl had been acting as head judge, but had to pull out of this competition as he was busy giving seminars in Europe. So, in his place, he had Roger Schwab, the head of Prejudging for the IFBB, and Winston Roberts, General Secretary of the IFBB, lead the panel of judges. Our remaining 5 judges for this competition were former AAU and IFBB champion Dr. Kim Voyages. Next, we had former New Jersey AFAB president and Marine Corps boxing champion, Dom Certo, followed by IFBB pro judge and former Mr. New Jersey, Tom Bizzocco. And our next judge was a familiar face to many in the crowd, and that was former Mr. Eastern America, George Payne. Payne actually also acted as an official for the AAU Metropolitan. All right, our 6th judge was an AAU official based out of Massachusetts, and that was Cliff Sawyer. And our final judge was John Calacioni, who served as scorekeeper. Okay, now let's list off our competitors, and actually this is the steepest lineup so far in the Grand Prix circuit, as there's 16 bodybuilders in this show. Okay, let's begin with our first competitor who was called out, and that was Casey Viator, fresh off his win in Pittsburgh, and Viator currently was holding 2nd place in the overall Grand Prix standings. Next, we had a familiar face from bodybuilding's past, but this time with a different name. Damian Poole, also known as Harold Poole, was on the comeback trail, as this would be his 2nd competition since coming out of retirement. Our next competitor was our only other Grand Prix champion, and that was Chris Dickerson. Dickerson held the lead at the moment with a total score of 58 points, only 2 ahead of Viator. Alright, moving on. Next we had Boyer Coe, who had been very consistent throughout all of his Grand Prix showings, not to mention the World Couples Championship. Next in the lineup was Roy Callender of Canada via Barbados, although I did read that Callender was considering moving to California as he felt that bodybuilding atmosphere was supercharged there, not to mention it had great weather. Alright, our next competitor was no stranger to the crowd, and that was New York native Annabelle Lopez. Alright, moving on. Next we had 2 returning Grand Prix competitors, and they were Tom Platz and Bill Grant. Our next competitor was actually making their Grand Prix debut, and that was former Mr. International, Mohamed Makawi. All right, moving on. Next, we had master poser Ed Corney, who had competed in previous shows in the series with not much fanfare, but man, did he make an impact in this show. All right, let's move on. Our next competitor, unfortunately, had no pictures featured in any of the magazines I found while researching the show, and that competitor was former pro Mr. America, Tommy Abar. I couldn't find much on him from this show, and anything I did find, it really wasn't good. Okay, moving on. Our next competitor was Mr. America's gym owner, the Phantom, Steve Mahalik. Okay, next in the lineup, fresh off a European tour, was England's Tony Emmett, followed by the Lion of Lebanon, Samir Bannout. Next after that, we had returning Grand Prix competitor and former world amateur bodybuilding champion, Carlos Rodriguez. Okay, and finally, our 16th competitor was returning 2-time Night of the Champions winner, Robbie Robinson. Now, before prejudging began, all 16 competitors met with the judges as they went over the IFBB's constitution and ground rules so that there wasn't any confusion during the competition. Co-head judge Roger Schwab led the meeting by addressing the casualness of previous judges handing out perfect scores of 20 points each to multiple competitors. And in this meeting, it was decided that a 20 represented a perfect score, and perfection doesn't come around so often. So with that in mind, each judge shall only be allowed to use a single 20 per round, which, I don't know, I think it's kind of weird to restrict the judges and tell them exactly how to vote, but that's just my opinion. All right, now that all that's out of the way, let's move on to round 1 of prejudging. Here, all the competitors stood relaxed as they would make their quarter turns for close comparisons. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a scorecard for this competition, but what I did find was that Roy Callender, Chris Dickerson, and Robbie Robinson all ended up tying with a total score of 96 points each. Closely following behind was Casey Viator with 95 points and Ed Corney with 94. All right, now let's move on to round 2, mandatory posing. And this round, Callender actually pulled ahead of the pack as he scored the highest amount of points, earning himself 98. And right behind him was Robinson and Dickerson, who both tied for 96 points each, followed by Viator earning another 95 points, and Corney with 94. After the second round finished, there was an intermission, and the show started back up in the evening with round 3, probably the most anticipated part of the night, and that was the free posing round. This part of the competition usually brings out the highest scores in the show, and this one was no different. Ed Corney and Chris Dickerson both earned perfect scores of 100 points each. And come to think of it, I think that's kind of breaking Roger Schwab's rules, but if there ever had to be an exception to breaking the rule, I think this is the best example. Both Corney and Dickerson are well known for their incredible posing, and from what I read, this night they didn't disappoint. Dickerson had the audience stunned as he posed to Dionne Warwick's I'll Never Love This Way Again, and Corney actually received a standing ovation for his flawless routine to Frank Sinatra's My Way. Robinson closely followed behind with a score of 98 points, followed by Callender with 96, who, according to some articles, seemed to have forgotten his routine at one point. And just behind him was Viator earning 95 points, and this seemed to be a bad round for Viator, as I kept reading that the judges and writers had many complaints about his posing style. Alright, now before we move on to the final round with the top 5 competitors, first I'd like to list off everyone else's final placings. So let's start with 16th place, and that went to Tommy Abar, and this one is kind of upsetting. Like I said before, there were no pictures of him from this competition, and with good reason, according to every article I found. After a 12-year hiatus, Abar was just not up to par with the lineup, and Chris Lund's article sums it up quite simply. Abar shouldn't have been in this competition. All right, moving on. In 15th place, we had Annabelle Lopez, who actually came into the show so much more improved from his first showing in Florida and continued to maintain his classic lines, but unfortunately in an IFBB show, in a lineup this stacked, it was real hard for him to make an impression. But where he did earn the crowd's respect was during his posing routine, as the Beacon Theater sound system blared the Mighty Mouse theme song for Lopez, which was very fitting for how he felt. And by no means was this former pro Mr. America a slouch, but here in the IFBB, he should have definitely put on more size. All right, next, coming in 14th place, was Tony Emmett. This former NABBA Mr. Universe was probably the calmest of the bunch, but appeared to be drained. Actually, in an article written by Chris Lund, he explained how Emmett had told him he was not in his best shape, and it showed. Lund also went on to say that, like many other competitors in the show, Tony appeared to be burned out from the series. All right, moving on to 13th place, and that went to Tom Platz. Platz came into the show nowhere near his best condition, and, don't get me wrong, Platz looked huge, and he wasn't completely out of shape, but he definitely didn't concentrate hard on his diet, and it makes sense because, according to Marilyn Guzman's article, Platz had recently been preoccupied traveling overseas for exhibitions and seminars. Okay, now we'll move on to 12th place, and that went to Harold Poole, or should I say Damien Poole. Like I said earlier, Poole had begun his comeback the year prior in Canada, where he didn't place, but less than a year later, he made some major improvements, but was still outclassed by the new crop of bodybuilders. All right, let's move on to 11th place, and that went to Samir Bannout. Bannout started this series in excellent condition and beat out some major players, but as each show continued, his physique began to wane. Similar to California and Pittsburgh, Samir showed up in New York holding a lot of water as he mistimed his peak again, which unfortunately hid his great physique. Okay, let's move on to our next competitor. In 10th place, we had the Iron Cowboy, Carlos Rodriguez. Rodriguez was currently living in Arizona, but lived in New York for some time, and according to one of the articles, he claimed to feel a bit out of place in New York, but you wouldn't know it on stage. Rodriguez showed up every show that he entered in great shape, or at least close to it, but like I said earlier, this was a stacked lineup. All right, moving on to ninth place, and that went to a new face on the Grand Prix scene, and that was Mohamed Makawi. Makawi looked really impressive with his great shape, but he didn't possess his universe-winning condition this evening, and according to one of the articles, Makawi's presentation was uninspiring, which is kind of weird to read about, but I guess at this point he hadn't linked up with Geronda yet. Anyway, some other interesting things I learned through my research was that Makawi was a man of many talents. Besides being one of the world's best bodybuilders, Makawi knew multiple languages and was actually an interpreter for the Egyptian Olympic Committee. And shortly after this competition, Makawi, along with his wife and son, moved to California so that he could attend UCLA's Fine Arts program. And this is probably my favorite part. It was all in hopes so he could become a cartoonist one day. Anyway, let's get back to bodybuilding. All right, coming in 8th place was Bill Grant. And according to one of the articles, Grant came in great shape and had made major improvements on all of his body parts, including his lacking ones. But what stood out the most for Grant was his posing routine. According to all the articles I found, Grant had a very entertaining and engaging posing routine set to disco music. Bill went on to tell one of the writers that he knew the judges disliked his choice of music, and I'm guessing it's because disco died the year prior in Chicago, but not New York. All right, now let's move on to 7th place, and that went to Long Island's Steve Mahalik. And for everything Mahalik's been through in the past 4 years, it's truly amazing to see this man step up on stage. But truth be told, even though he escaped death, overcame paralysis, and rebuilt his physique, Steve admitted to one of the writers that he still suffered a great deal of pain in certain areas while training. And I'm sure his intensity and sanity style didn't help, but that was his MO. And Mahalik looked very good this evening, but his face gave the impression that he too was burned out from the succession of shows and trying to constantly peak. Okay, let's move on to 6th place, and that went to Boyer Coe. And for the first time in his IFBB career, Coe had placed out of the top 5. Similar to previous shows, Coe showed up in great shape, but not his best. And this was done by design as he was trying to work his way up to the Olympia. But I personally think Boyer didn't take this show 100% too serious, and take that statement with a grain of salt. And the reason I'm saying that is because Boyer actually guest posed with his wife for this competition. Oh, and speaking of guest posing, since we're on the topic, the audience was also treated to a posing exhibition performed by the 16-woman bodybuilding club named The Physiques. These 16 bodybuilders were based out of Mainline Nautilus facility in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and were directed by Susan Fry. Okay, now we can move on to the part that everybody's been waiting for, round 4, the final pose down. In this round, the top 5 competitors were called to the stage, and actually unlike any of the other shows, each competitor shook hands with each other as a congratulations for making it this far, before each of them laid it all out for the judges. Okay, let's start with 5th place, and that went to Casey Viator. Every single article I found said the same thing. Viator looked burned out, and it showed through his physique. Actually, I found a very interesting article by Viator that was published a few months after this competition. Viator actually went on to describe the Grand Prix series as one of the roughest ordeals of his life. Emotionally, it took a toll on him, and he found himself to become pretty irritable while training. And on top of that, he actually went on to voice some personal gripes with the promotion of the Grand Prix series. First, he explains that he felt the competitions were spaced too far apart. Instead of a gap of several weeks in between each show, Viator felt that the series of shows should run over the course of 6 weeks. Another one of his complaints was actually about his fellow competitors popping in and out of the Grand Prix circuit. And I could see this being frustrating for Viator as he made it a point to enter every single one of the 5 shows. And he went on to explain some other issues, but in the end he said he was just glad it's over and took his check for $1,000. All right, now let's move on to 4th place, and that went to the incredibly muscular Ed Corney. Corney was in the best shape of his life according to Bill Reynolds, and I couldn't agree more. Reynolds continued to point out that he had even looked better than he did at the 77 Olympia, where he had placed 3rd. Now, on top of his trademark posing skills, Corney brought a level of conditioning that really tested the lineup, but sadly was up against tough competition. Me personally, I feel like he could have placed higher, but Corney was a professional and took his check for $1,500 with a smile. All right, now moving on to 3rd place, and that went to Roy Callender. Callender was by far the biggest man in this competition, and according to Chris Lund's article, he described him as massive and cut to ribbons, but I would disagree with that. Callender definitely looked great, but I felt his quads could be a bit sharper, and from what I was able to dig up, a few other writers felt the same way. In Steve Robinson's Ironman article, he describes Callender as not looking as conditioned as he did in Pittsburgh. Regardless, Callender had great size overall, not to mention one of the best chests in bodybuilding. His posing routine, although not perfect, was definitely entertaining for the crowd, and for all of his efforts, Callender ended up taking home $2,000. All right, now on to second place, and that was awarded to Robbie Robinson. Robinson looked fantastic, according to most articles, and unlike previous shows in the circuit, Robinson came into the show ready to take first place. And he easily could have, as he was the returning champion and had the audience on his side, but according to some coverage I found in Ironman magazine, Robinson was a shade off his best and was lacking major cuts in his legs. But here's an interesting fact I found, and that was Robinson actually had received the most first place votes in the final round, as he earned 3 points from the judges. And 2 of the other first place votes were split between Callender and Corney, and the remaining 2 votes were given to our first place winner. But Robinson took his placing in stride and with a smile as he earned a check for $3,000. All right, now into our first place winner of the Night of the Champions and Grand Prix champion, and that was Chris Dickerson. Dickerson showed up to this competition maintaining his perfect symmetry, but similar to Viator, he had looked like he was starting to show some wear due to competing in 6 straight shows over the last 4 months. And according to Chris Lund's article, he began by saying he wasn't too impressed with Dickerson and didn't understand all the hype, but by round 3, and after seeing his posing routine, he quickly changed his mind. And co-head judge Roger Schwab, who also wrote for Ironman magazine, had said that Dickerson had an incredible stage presence that made him come off as if he was flawless. After the competition, Dickerson was asked how he was able to peak so often, and he explained that it wasn't so much about peaking as it was just maintaining his diet and training. But he is human, and he did admit that the series did take a tremendous mental effort. And for all that effort, Dickerson was not only awarded a check for $5,000, but he was also given the Weider Trophy for winning the Grand Prix Championship. And to boot, Da Vinci Labs also awarded Dickerson with an engraved gold ring valued at $3,000. So in total, Dickerson made well over $20,000 throughout the Grand Prix circuit. And for anyone who's curious at home, Dickerson's final score was 74 points, 11 points ahead of Viator. Okay, that's going to do it for the 1980 Grand Prix circuit. Thank you everyone for joining me through this series, and if you liked the video, please don't forget to leave a thumbs up and to subscribe to the channel because we have a lot more coming in the near future. And please, if you haven't already, check out my Instagram page at @RetroMuscleMags. I'm going to be setting up some giveaways of classic magazines that I have doubles of, so please stay tuned, and I'll see you guys next time.